In 2013, the Providence Preservation Society hired historic preservation consultant Kathryn J. Cavanaugh to conduct an updated historic architectural survey of a small 12-block area around Cooke Street on the eastern edge of the College Hill neighborhood and the northern edge of the Fox Point neighborhood. This presentation summarizes the findings and recommendations of the project, which was funded by grants from the Antoinette F. Downing Fund for Rhode Island of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and from the ADDD Fund at the Rhode Island Foundation. The presentation lasts about 1 hour. The study area, seen here, was roughly bounded by Angel Street on the north, Governor Street on the east, Young Orchard Avenue on the south, and Hope Street on the west. In addition to Cooke Street, it also included portions of Manning, George, Benevolent, and Waterman Streets. Most of the 138 buildings in this study area were residences, built between about 1815 and 1930. Some of these houses were converted to office use in the second half of the 20th century, and there are also some larger commercial and institutional buildings, as well as apartment buildings, constructed here during that later period. A previous historic architectural survey of this area was done about 40 years ago, in the early to mid-1970s, by the Rhode Island Historical Preservation Commission, our state historic preservation agency. Information was recorded about the architectural features of individual buildings, photos were taken, and some basic research was done to determine when each building was constructed, its original use, and its historic name, which for a house was typically that of the original owner. Surveys like this are the basic building blocks of historic preservation programs in local communities. We identify buildings, structures, objects, and sites that have historical and architectural significance, and those findings are then utilized to recommend further preservation activities, such as nomination to the National Register of Historic Places and designation of local historic district zones. And indeed, in the 1970s, portions of the Cooke Street study area were included in 4 separate historic districts listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The study area also includes 2 National Historic Landmarks and several properties documented by the Historic American Building Survey. We'll look at those in more depth later in the presentation. Adjacent to the study area, 2 local historic district overlay zones have been established by the City of Providence. A large district of about 945 properties on College Hill, which was first created in 1960 and later expanded in 1977 and 1990, and a smaller district of 32 properties concentrated around Stimson Avenue, which was established in 1981. Part of PPS's reasoning for updating the 1970s survey was to determine if the Cooke Street study area might qualify to be included in an extension of the College Hill Historic District Overlay Zone, which would provide some additional protection for the area's historic architectural character. Later in this presentation, I'll discuss historic district zoning in more detail and what that means for property owners. But first, I'll briefly describe the methodology for the updated survey, the historical development of the Cooke Street neighborhood, and some of the important and interesting buildings within it. The survey update, done in 2013, resulted in new survey forms, like this one, for each of the 138 primary buildings in the study area. For each property, the survey tasks were to provide current exterior architectural data and photos, to confirm earlier research findings as to historic names and construction dates for each building and to make corrections as needed, to identify any visibly evident exterior changes to buildings that had occurred over the past 4 decades, to assess the integrity of each building's exterior architectural features, that is, how well preserved the building was, both in terms of original or historic materials and design, and finally to recommend, based on the findings of the updated survey, boundaries for extending the College Hill Local Historic District into part or all of the study area. By the way, both the 1970s and 2013 survey forms are on file and available to the public at the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission offices at 150 Benefit Street in Providence. The Cooke Street neighborhood was built up during a period of tremendous growth and prosperity in Providence, thanks to a booming industrial economy. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, Providence evolved from a small town into a major metropolitan area. The city tripled in physical size, grew over 20 times larger in population, and became the state's center of government, manufacturing, business, finance, transportation, education, and culture. By 1900, there were more people living in Providence than ever before, thanks to foreign immigration and a burgeoning middle class. Moreover, there were also more wealthy people than ever before, and Providence was ranked the second most affluent city in the nation per capita. The housing on and around Cooke Street, like much of the rest of College Hill, typically ranges from 2 to 3 stories tall, is constructed of wood or brick, and reflects a range of comfortable to luxurious lifestyles enjoyed by middle and upper income residents in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But there are also some rather distinctive characteristics here that set this area apart. First, in terms of density, this is really a suburban enclave in the midst of an urban neighborhood. As you can see from this map, many of the house lots here are quite sizable. Some are as big as half an acre or more. This pattern of development was established in the mid-19th century when some of Rhode Island's major industrialists and political leaders built large, architect-designed, single-family homes on what could be characterized as mini estates, some of which originally occupied as much as half or even an entire city block. All of those larger properties were later subdivided for additional housing construction, but there are still relatively few buildings per block. Look at the difference between Cooke and Governor Streets, both on the map and in these photos. They are only a block apart, yet the streetscapes have a completely different look and feel. Among the significant historic buildings in the Cooke Street neighborhood are over a dozen surviving carriage houses, stables, and garages, most of which have been converted to residential or office use. Other important character-defining elements include the siting of buildings as well as their landscape features. The large lot sizes often allowed houses to be set fairly far back from the street, and because of the topography here, many of them are also elevated some distance above street level, anywhere from a couple of feet to nearly a full story. Thus, many properties have retaining walls around their perimeters. The combination of setback and elevation enhanced the visual prominence of these houses, especially those on corner lots, which probably appealed to those who wanted to show off their wealth and status. The physical distance that they created reinforced the separation between the public realm of the street and the private realm of the house, and that separation was further enhanced by walls, fences, and plantings. This is particularly evident on Hope, Cooke, and Manning Streets, where there are many examples of tall walls of stone, brick, and stuccoed masonry, fences of wood and wrought iron, and sometimes gates as well. The combined effect of these character-defining site and landscape elements creates an impression not only of privacy, but of exclusivity, which is consistent with the socioeconomic status of many of the people who built houses here. Another distinctive characteristic of this neighborhood is the presence of several family compounds of 2, 3, or even 4 houses built next to or near each other by people who were related to each other. Some of these family houses were built close together in time as well as space. Others were built over a period of several decades. And finally, the architecture here itself is quite distinctive. This 12-block area is like a museum of important Providence architects. Over 24 architects are represented, often with multiple examples of their work, including John Holden Green, Thomas Taft, and Stone, Carpenter, and Wilson, to name just a few. Architectural styles here range from the formality of the Federal period to the eclecticism of the Victorian era in the 19th century, and from the traditionalism of colonial revival to a decidedly non-traditional modernism in the 20th century. By the early 19th century, Providence was already nearing its 200th birthday, and its economy was transitioning from shipping and trade to manufacturing. The west slope of College Hill, where most people lived and worked, was getting pretty crowded. As development started to spread out, much of it went west, across the Providence River, where the land was less hilly and swampy than it was in much of the east side at that time. Everything east of Hope Street and north of Olney Street, called Olney's Lane on this map, was farmland and was considered the country. But sitting right at the very top of College Hill was about 50 acres of open land that turned out to be a prime location for new housing development. A bit removed from the most densely populated part of town, and a bit of an effort to climb uphill to get here, but conveniently situated near the intersection of two major travel routes, Hope Street and Angel Street, which provided direct access to bridge crossings over the Seekonk River, as well as to the waterfront commercial and industrial districts at India Point and on South Main and South Water Streets. Best of all, the land here on top of the hill was high, dry, and readily buildable. The bulk of this open space, about 30 acres, now bounded by Hope, Power, Governor, and George Streets, was called the Young Orchard Farm. In the late 18th century, this farm was owned by Nicholas Cooke, a wealthy sea captain and merchant who also served as governor of Rhode Island from 1770 to 1778. So he was the last colonial governor and the first governor of the newly independent state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Cooke's farm was partly bounded on the south and east by another farm belonging to the Fenner family. Between the two farms was a road originally called Fenner Street, later renamed Governor Street because both Arthur Fenner and his son James Fenner served as governors of Rhode Island after the Revolutionary War and for much of the first half of the 19th century. But since Nicholas Cooke preceded both of them in office, he probably should get some credit for that street name as well. After Nicholas Cooke died in 1782, the Young Orchard Farm was divided amongst his numerous heirs. In 1803, a plat of house lots was recorded for the northern part of the farm, laying out extensions of Benevolent and George Streets between Hope and Governor, with Cooke Street in the middle. Notice the grid-like layout of the streets and that the house lots are mostly a standard size, 50 feet by 100 feet or 5,000 square feet. This is one of the earliest residential subdivisions on the land east of Hope Street, and considering that there were no buildings here at all in 1803, it is striking how this plat anticipates density at an urban scale, more urban than was actually built, as it turned out. A second, smaller but similarly configured plat was recorded on the southern end of the farm in 1816, laying out Young Orchard Avenue and another section of Cooke Street just north of Power Street. This was the first plat on the Young Orchard Farm to see new housing built, and it happened quite quickly. In 1819, Nicholas Cooke's grandson, Joseph S. Cooke, built a home on a large lot at the corner of Hope and Power Streets. This house remained in the Cooke family until 1871, by which time it had the address 148 Power Street. In 1885, the property was divided in half, and the Cooke house was moved to the northern lot. It was reoriented to face west instead of south, and its address was changed to 125 Hope Street. You can see the identical footprint of the building turned 90 degrees on these two maps. This is one of several federal-style homes in this neighborhood. Note the symmetrical 5-bay facade with deeply recessed, elliptical curved center entrance, and the rooftop monitor fronted by a decorative balustrade. The stucco finish and the twin chimneys that rise above the facade are rare for this period. Normally, the chimneys would be at the sides. Note also the siting of the house several feet above street grade and the stone retaining wall topped by a decorative wooden fence. The first house on Cooke Street appeared shortly after the 1816 Young Orchard Farm plat was recorded. It was built by Robert S. Burra, who worked for the U.S. Customs District. Burra was related to the Cooke family, and he had previously lived next door to John Holden Green, Providence's most distinguished early 19th century architect. Among Green's well-known works are the Sullivan Door House on Benefit Street, the Cathedral of St. John on North Main Street, and the First Unitarian Church at the corner of Benefit and Benevolent Streets. Green also designed several houses on Power and Cooke Street, including this one at 6 Cooke, which is one of the finest federal-style residences in Providence. In contrast to the Joseph Cooke house, this one has the more typical clapboard siding, wooden quoins trimming the corners, and chimneys at the sides. It also has the distinctive monitor-on-hip roof with decorative balustrades and a broad elliptical fanlight over the center entrance. About a decade later, around 1826, Shoebale Blanding, a trader and merchant, constructed a new home 1 block to the north at 20 Cooke Street. This, too, is in the federal style. Note the characteristic hip roof with monitor and balustrade on top, side chimney, and the accentuation of the main entrance, here with a portico. Both the Burra and Blanding houses were recorded by the Historic American Building Survey in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This was a joint program of the National Park Service and the Library of Congress, begun in 1933 to document the diverse range of historic building types and architectural designs in the United States. As we can see from these black and white Habs photos taken in 1957, both of these houses have remained extremely well preserved since then. There are 3 other houses associated with the Burra family in this neighborhood. James Burra built this house at 160 Power Street, around the corner from his brother Robert's house, in 1818. This was also designed by John Holden Green in kind of a stripped-down version of the federal style. It's also smaller in size and scale than Robert's house. And next door to Robert Burra's house is a late Victorian-style row house built about 1878 by his daughters, Anne F. Draper and Lucy A. Draper. The sisters were married to brothers. Row houses are rare in Providence. This one is actually 2 attached double houses. Anne and Lucy each owned one of the houses, occupied one dwelling unit, and rented out the other. 2-family housing started to become more common in many Providence neighborhoods in the second half of the 19th century, when the city's population was booming. Most of the other 2-family houses in this neighborhood are located a block away, on Governor Street. But the Draper sisters had inherited this land from their parents, and so they built here on Cooke Street. In the 1950s, a pair of architects bought the entire row, removed or greatly simplified much of the original high Victorian Gothic exterior detailing, which by the 1950s had become unfashionable, and they also painted the entire building white. The 4th house associated with the Burra family was built by Robert Burra himself about 1825, about a decade after his first house on Cooke Street. This was the first house built in the northern plat of the former Young Orchard Farm, on a sizable lot at the corner of Cooke and Benevolent Streets. This, too, was designed by John Holden Green. Originally, the house was only 2 stories tall. You can still see the federal-style bones here, in the symmetry of the facade with its center entrance, the coins at the corners, the Palladian window over the front door, and the rooftop balustrade. However, that balustrade now tops a 3rd floor that was added in the mid-19th century, along with the porches on either side of the house, one of which was later enclosed. This house was substantially renovated again around 1902 with colonial revival detailing, such as the front portico and the modified Palladian window at the 3rd floor center. That front portico was originally 2 stories, as we can see in the late 1950s black and white photo. These alterations were designed by Stone, Carpenter, and Wilson, the preeminent Providence architectural firm in the late 19th century. That firm has easily half a dozen buildings in this little neighborhood alone. We'll see several others a bit later. The owner of the house at the time of these renovations was Nelson W. Aldrich, who served in the United States Senate for 30 years, from 1881 to 1911. His influence was so strong, especially on the American financial system, that both the press and the public called him the general manager of the nation. Among other achievements, he helped to establish the Federal Reserve. This house was also recorded by Habs, and for its associations with Aldrich's legendary political career, it was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1976. The senator's grandson, Winthrop W. Aldrich, chairman of Chase National Bank, ended up inheriting this house, and in 1974 he donated it to the Rhode Island Historical Society, which has used it as its headquarters since then. Winthrop Aldrich built a guest house across Cooke Street from the main house in 1967 on a large lot previously occupied by the Charles Morris Smith House, which is shown in this black and white photo. The Smith House used to stand at 112 Benevolent Street. It had been built in 1895 and was demolished in 1966. The Aldrich Guest House occupies the former site of the Smith Carriage House. On this map, that's the building with the X drawn on it. Facing George Street, the guest house was designed by Campbell, Aldrich, and McNulty of Boston in a neo-colonial mode. The Aldrich of that architectural firm was Nelson W. Aldrich, the namesake and great-great-grandson of the senator. Like Aldrich House itself, the guest house property has extensive gardens and a handsome wooden fence around it. It, too, was donated to the Rhode Island Historical Society in 1974. Since the society sold it in the 1980s, it has been a private residence. The street pattern in this neighborhood was completed by the 1850s in several small development plats recorded by various owners on the 20-some acres north of the former Young Orchard Farm. Manning Street, running from Thayer Street to Governor Street, was named for the Reverend James Manning, the first president of the College of Rhode Island, later Brown University. Waterman Street was extended eastward from Hope Street, and Cooke Street was extended northward all the way to Ainger Street. By this time, a plat of house lots had been recorded on the former Fenner Farm. You can see some of those lots here on the east side of Governor Street. Notice that except for Angel and Power Streets, none of the other cross streets align from one side of Governor Street to the other. In this era of rapid growth and development in Providence, there was no such thing as comprehensive planning on the part of city government, so it was very common for one property owner to record a development plat, including the layout of new public streets, with absolutely no regard for whatever might be proposed on the neighboring owner's lands. When you see intersections like these, where streets don't align properly, that's often a clue as to where two different plats butted up against each other. Waterman Street was straightened out when a streetcar line was built in the late 19th century, but the other intersections are still today much the same as they were in 1857. Notice also how much larger the house lots are between Hope and Governor Streets than they are south of Power Street or east of Governor Street. Those little 5,000 square foot lots that had originally been platted here several decades earlier were bought up in multiples and then merged into sizable properties by some of the prominent citizens who took up residence here beginning in the 1840s and 50s. We also see family members owning adjacent properties like the Spraggs, the Smiths, and the Lippetts. The map clues us in about their socioeconomic status as well. Look at how much bigger the building footprints are, and how many of the houses have stables or carriage houses behind them too, within the area bounded by Hope, Angel, Cooke, and Young Orchard, as opposed to houses on both sides of Power Street, which were built several decades earlier. The Italianate style, reminiscent of palazzos and villas of the Renaissance era, came into vogue in the middle of the 19th century. The Lippett family, owners of the Lippett Woolen Company and several textile mills, built 3 Italianate-style houses on Hope Street between Angel and Waterman Streets within a 10-year period, bracketing the Civil War. The first of the Lippett houses was built in 1854 at the corner of Hope and Waterman Streets, and it belonged to Robert and Louisa Lippett. It was designed by Thomas Taft, who was the preeminent Providence architect of the mid-19th century. Among his other well-known works were the first Union Station downtown, which used to stand in what is now Kennedy Plaza, and additions to the Old State House and the Nightingale Brown House, both on Benefit Street. Robert Lippett's house is a rather simple example of the Italianate style, a brick cube with columned central entrance portico and brownstone trim, but it's quite large, 3 stories with a 2-story L at the rear, and it stands several feet above street level with its lot partly enclosed by a handsome brownstone retaining wall, so it has a commanding presence at this intersection. On the 1857 map, we can see what looks like a large outbuilding behind this house, straddling the line between Robert's property and a vacant lot owned by his brother, Henry Lippett, next door. This was actually a complex of 4 attached brick buildings used as stables and carriage houses, all likely also designed by Thomas Taft, 3 of which still stand. The one on Robert Lippett's property was later used as a garage, here it is in the late 1950s, until it was converted into a single-family home in 1977. This is just one of about a dozen examples in the Cooke Street neighborhood of historic stables, carriage houses, and garages being adaptively reused for housing or for institutional or commercial uses in the late 20th century. Robert Lippett's brother, Henry Lippett, built 2 homes at the intersection of Hope and Angel Streets. The first, built between 1855 and 1857, was designed by architect Russell Warren, who at that point was near the end of his long and distinguished career. Among his well-known works are the Westminster Street facade of the Arcade and Athenaeum Row on Benefit Street, both designed in the predominant Greek Revival style of the 1820s to the 1840s. This first Henry Lippett house is an Italianate-style double house, divided in half vertically, with entrances to the separate dwelling units on the north and south sides. Note the more pronounced bracketed cornice, the brownstone trim on the windows, and the loggia-style entrance porch on the north side, and similar detailing on the adjacent bay window there. This house is also situated several feet above grade, with a stone retaining wall. Family members occupied both dwelling units until Henry Lippett sold the southern half of the house in 1861 and the northern half in 1865. The term condominium was not coined until almost a century later, but this house may be the first example of that form of housing ownership in Providence. Shortly after Henry and his wife Mary moved into this house, they suffered a family tragedy. 3 of their sons died from scarlet fever, and their 4-year-old daughter Jeannie was rendered deaf by the disease. This tragedy may have prompted them to decide to sell this house because a decade later, in 1863 to 1865, the Lippetts built this far more lavish Italianate residence. Henry Lippett himself contributed to the design, which was executed by builder Henry Childs. This has much the same symmetrical brick cube form as Robert Lippett's house next door, but it also features a projecting pedimented pavilion with curved portico at the front, a 3-story curved bay window on the south side, and a porte-cochere on the north side. The interior of the second Lippett house, with its carved mantelpieces, ornate moldings, and lavishly painted walls and ceilings, is the epitome of high Victorian interior decor. This house, too, was recorded by Habs and was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1976. The Lippett family occupied this house until 1981, when it was given to Preserve Rhode Island and became a historic house museum. In addition to his business interests, Henry Lippett also served as governor of Rhode Island from 1873 to 1875. Mary Lippett was a prominent advocate for the deaf, and as Rhode Island First Lady, she helped establish the Rhode Island School for the Deaf, the first such institution in the state, in 1876. 2 of the Lippett sons also held political office. Charles Warren Lippett served as governor in 1895 to 1897, and Henry F. Lippett served as United States Senator from 1911 to 1917, succeeding Nelson W. Aldrich. A fourth house associated with the Lippett family was built in 1912, around the corner at 271 Angel Street. This was built by Henry and Mary's youngest daughter, Mary Balch Lippett Steedman. She was a widow when she built this large house. It was designed by Clark, Howe, and Homer in the Colonial Revival style. The 1918 map, seen here, shows Mary's house standing behind her childhood home, which was then owned by her sister, Abby F. Hunter. Note the two outbuildings straddling the property lines between Mary's and Abby's houses. These are the other survivors of the 1854 complex of stables and carriage houses that had originally been built behind their Uncle Robert's house. We've already seen the converted carriage house there. These two are attached to the back of that structure. Among the many technological innovations of the industrial era was the balloon frame for building construction, which was lightweight and easily adapted to complex shapes. Manufacturing also allowed the standardization and mass production of building components like boards, nails, windows, doors, roofing, siding, and decorative details. As a result, houses could not only be built faster and cheaper, but architects and builders could also utilize multiple corners, wall extensions, overhangs, curves, projections, recesses, varied textures and colors of materials, and elaborate ornamentation. Housing design became much more diverse, taking inspiration from medieval, classical, and other European prototypes, and often freely mixing elements of different styles together. The next series of houses we'll look at reflect the eclecticism of this period. At the corner of Waterman and Hope Street is the Horatio N. Campbell House, designed by William R. Walker and built in 1877. Walker had a long and prolific career working with several partners, including his own son and grandson in later years. He designed residential, commercial, religious, and public buildings all over Rhode Island. In Providence, his work included the Brown University Library, now Robinson Hall at the corner of Waterman and Prospect Streets, and the Cranston Street Armory. The Campbell House, built for a woolen merchant, is an exuberant and monumental example of the Second Empire style, with the characteristic mansard roof, here elaborated with a prominent central front dormer and a tower on the west side. Note also the hefty front portico and porte cochere on the east side, as well as the paired brackets under the cornice. 1 block south on Hope Street at the corner of Manning Street is this fabulous gem, the Esther Hinckley Baker House, built in 1882. This house was designed by Edmund R. Wilson, who was only 27 years old at the time and working at the architectural firm of Stone and Carpenter, where he later became a partner. This is one of the best examples of the Queen Anne style in all of Providence. The variable textures of the materials and the projections and recesses seen all over the house, not only in its overall massing, but in the numerous gables, bay windows, porches. Note the sleeping porch on the second floor of the south side. All of these are characteristic of that style. The materials here are particularly rich. Stone on the first floor, gray-green slate on the upper floors, red slate on the roof, and stone and wood trim. The diagonal section that links the two street facades, each of which has a principal entrance, is a clever way of dealing with the corner here. Esther Hinckley Baker is something of a mystery. Little is known of her other than that she was a single and apparently quite well-to-do lady who came to Providence from Boston and lived alone in this enormous house for about 40 years until her death in 1923. Presumably she had live-in servants and perhaps occasional house guests to keep her company. In the next block further south, at the corner of Hope and George Streets, is another Stone, Carpenter, and Wilson design, the Zachariah Chaffee Jr. house, built in 1887. This house combines late Victorian elements like the gabled bay window on the side with colonial revival details like the pedimented front door and the splayed keystone lintels over the windows. Zachariah Chaffee was a treasurer at Builder's Iron Foundry. He had grown up just a couple of blocks from here in a house at the corner of Power and Cooke Street. This house was originally built a few blocks away at 129 Hope Street. Brown University acquired the house in its original location in 1969, and the Life Sciences Department occupied the building for several years. In 1977, the house was sold and relocated to its current site at 169 Hope Street. The original site for the Chaffee House is now a garden tended by Brown students. Notice the brick wall surrounding the Chaffee House? That is a remnant of the house that used to stand in this location, shown here on the 1895 map. The Amos D. Smith House was built in the 1850s and demolished in 1973. There were in fact two Smith houses in this block of Hope Street, both built in the 1850s, but neither survives. Just across George Street is another stone Carpenter and Wilson design, the Taft Smith House at 165 Hope Street, built in 1888 to 89. This too shows a mix of styles. The corner tower evokes the Queen Anne, while the gambrel roof, Palladian window over the entrance, the modillion cornice, and the broken scroll pediment on the dormer are all colonial revival elements. The house is sited high above the street. The brick retaining walls are actually incorporated into the side of the building along George Street. Those tall evergreens in the front yard have only grown there fairly recently, as you can see in this photo from the 1950s. This house was built by Governor Royal Taft, a textile manufacturer who owned the Coventry Company and happened to be Rhode Island's chief executive during the same 2 years that it took to construct this house. Governor Taft built it for his eldest daughter, Amy, and her husband George Smith, a merchant who, as far as I know, was no relation to their neighbor, Amos D. Smith. About 5 years later, Amy's brother, Robert Taft, who was also a director of the Coventry Company, and his wife Alice moved to Hope Street, a block south of here at the corner of Benevolent Street. This, too, is a stone Carpenter and Wilson design and one of the finest early colonial revival houses in Providence. Colonial revival began to appear in the 1890s and was predominant well into the 1930s. Here, Edmund Wilson was inspired by an important local example of an actual colonial house, the Joseph Brown House on South Main Street, built in 1774. Note Wilson's choice of an ogee curve for the roof line, the front portico, and the dormers on the roof. The symmetrical 5-bay facade, center entrance, flared lintels over the windows, and the multi-light wood windows themselves, including the gracefully curved muntins in the solarium and in the dormers, are all characteristic of colonial revival. Since the 1940s, this house has been in institutional use, first for Bryant College and then for Brown University, which continues to house students here in a residence hall. This house was recorded by Habs. This 1957 photo shows a rooftop balustrade and a fence that no longer exist, but otherwise, the Taft House is in a very good state of preservation. There are numerous other examples of colonial revival, both in brick and in wood, throughout this neighborhood. The next few slides show some variations on that style over a period of 30-some years. Most of these houses also feature the same characteristic siting above the street and heavily landscaped yards enclosed by walls that had been established decades earlier in this neighborhood. The Howland House at 69 Manning Street was built in 1893 to 94 for the manager and treasurer of the Providence Journal. This house stands perpendicular to the street, and it still has remnants of late Victorian design in its complex massing with several projections at the front and sides, but the Palladian window over the front porch on the west facade of the house and the triple windows on the north side are classic colonial revival. This house was purchased by Brown University in 1952. It was first used as the Graduate Center and later became the second building of French House, a residence for students of that language and culture located next door at 67 Manning Street. It returned to private ownership and single-family use in the late 20th century. The Parks House at 61 Cooke Street, designed by architects Martin and Hall, was built in 1900 for a jewelry manufacturer and his wife. This is a very large house on a prominent corner site. Note the ogee curve of the dormers, the Palladian window over the front door, and the solarium at the side with curved muntins in the windows. The Jeanette Huntoon House at the corner of Manning and Cooke Streets, built in 1924 to 25, was designed by Jackson, Robertson, and Adams, whose other well-known work includes the Providence County Courthouse between South Main and Benefit Streets. This house is notable for having equal emphasis on both street front elevations, which each have a 5-bay facade with center entrance topped by a curved pediment or trim element. Mrs. Huntoon built this house shortly after the death of her husband, Harrison B. Huntoon, founder of the Providence Braid Company and Woodlawn Finishing Company. Across the street, the Elizabeth G. Wood House at 72 Manning, designed by Church and Howe and built in 1930, was directly inspired by John Holden Greene's work. You can see many similarities with the Borough House at 6 Cooke Street, for example. Mrs. Wood was also a widow when this house was constructed. The Merriman family also built several houses in this neighborhood in the early 20th century, all in different architectural styles. The patriarch was Charles H. Merriman, who, together with partners Charles W. Lippett and Henry F. Lippett, owned the Manville Mill in Lincoln and the Social, Nurse, and Globe Mills, all in Woonsocket. In 1891, Charles Merriman purchased this Italianate-style brick house at the corner of Cooke and Benevolent Streets, which had been built in the early 1870s for a cotton dealer named Benjamin B. Adams. Merriman built this charming brick carriage house at the rear of his property, facing Benevolent Street, sometime between 1896 and 1908. The carriage house is now in residential use. Charles Merriman had 3 sons, all of whom grew up in this house, worked in the family businesses, and built new homes near their fathers in the early 20th century. Harold Merriman's 1907 house at the corner of Governor and George Street is, uniquely for this neighborhood, a late example of a Gothic Revival-inspired design, with its multiple gables, including on the front porch, and overhanging second story. The architects here were Stone, Carpenter, and Wilson. A garage for this house was built across the street by 1918. It was converted to office use in the 1960s. A block west of Harold's house, Charles Merriman Jr. built this colonial revival-style house at the corner of Cooke and George Streets in 1909. Note the ogee gables on the front portico and the dormers, which we've seen before, and were a favorite motif in Providence in the early 20th century. The architects here were Stone, Carpenter, and Sheldon. Edmund Wilson had died by this time. And around the corner from Charles Jr.'s house on Manning Street, Helen and E. Bruce Merriman built this extravagant Italian Renaissance home in 1912. The architects were the Boston firm of Parker, Thomas, and Rice, who specialized in European-inspired villas. This stuccoed house has a central block flanked by 2 wings and is surrounded by tall walls, fencing, and plantings. Later owners acquired the lot behind this house, extending the property all the way to Waterman Street, and built several large rear additions. So far, we've mostly seen houses that were built for wealthy and prominent people, but the edges of the Cooke Street neighborhood did see some diversification of economic classes and housing types during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By the 1890s, there were electric streetcar lines running on Governor, Angel, and Waterman Streets, represented by dotted black lines on this map, which prompted more dense development for both middle-class and working-class residents on and near those streets. Notice how much smaller and closer together the houses are on Angel Street and on Governor Street. Governor Street in particular has a markedly different architectural character from the other streets that we've seen so far, with numerous multifamily dwellings built between 1890 and 1930. Among the earliest of these is also by far the biggest, St. Maria's Home for Working Girls, built in 1893 on the site of what had been the Governor Fenner House, and designed by architects Martin and Hall. The construction of this building was funded by Joseph Bannigan, who had immigrated to Providence as an 8-year-old child, fleeing the Irish potato famine in 1847. 20 years later, Bannigan founded the Woonsocket Rubber Company, manufacturers of rubber-soled footwear. By 1893, Bannigan had become president of the United States Rubber Company and was Rhode Island's first Irish Catholic millionaire. He was also a generous philanthropist who supported a number of Irish and Catholic charities. St. Maria's Home provided accommodation to young single women who had come to Providence to seek employment, for example in an office, in a mill, as a teacher, or as a domestic servant. This building, now called the Governor, currently provides affordable apartments for the elderly. Governor Street, like much of the adjacent Fox Point neighborhood, had a substantial Irish population. By the end of the 19th century, many second and third generation Irish Americans had moved up the economic ladder far enough to have the means to invest in real estate. About a dozen houses on Governor Street, between Power Street and Waterman Street, were built by people with Irish surnames. Stylistically, these houses exhibit some of the same influences as in the more high-style buildings just a block or two away. The Hennessy House is a combination of Queen Anne, with that distinctive corner tower, and Colonial Revival, as you can see in the Palladian window in the attic level. The Hines, McCarthy, and Sheridan houses all have Colonial Revival detailing, especially on their porches. This neighborhood also has several houses that represent the evolution of a modernist design aesthetic in the first half of the 20th century. The Parker House at 67 Manning Street, designed by Franklin J. Sawtelle and built in 1902, evokes the prairie style of Frank Lloyd Wright, which was just emerging at that time and, in contrast to the very traditional Colonial Revival mode, did not mimic historic forms or detailing. Characteristic elements seen here include the low-pitched hip roof with widely overhanging eaves, the detailing that emphasizes horizontal lines, here including variation in materials and colors, and the massive square piers of masonry supporting the front porch. This house was purchased by Brown University in 1955 and became French House, a residence for students of that language and culture, which, as we've seen before, later expanded to also occupy the house next door at 69 Manning, which you can just see at the left side of the photo. This house returned to single-family use in the late 20th century. These two houses, 177 Hope Street and 47 Manning Street, were built in 1939 and 1941, both designed by the firm of Geddes and Kelly. You can see some echoes of the traditional in the use of brick, the hip roof, and the boxy massing. But in keeping with a modernist emphasis on austerity, simplicity, streamlining, and basic functionality, these houses have almost no decorative detailing. Notice too the built-in garage at 47 Manning, a feature that would become increasingly common in the mid-20th century and remains so today. Both of these houses were built by the India Point Corporation, one of whose trustees was Rush Sturgis, a prominent attorney and businessman who also served on the Providence City Council for several years and participated in many civic causes. Both houses were rented out initially, but Rush Sturgis later lived at 47 Manning for more than a decade. The tall stucco wall surrounding both houses was built for the previous house on this site, which had been acquired by the Sturgis family in the late 19th century and is seen on this 1908 map, a large house on a nearly 30,000 square foot lot owned by Russ Sturgis's mother, Alice Knight Sturgis. She was the daughter of B. B. Knight, one of the partners in the Fruit of the Loom Manufacturing Company, and the widow of Howard O. Sturgis, also a cotton cloth manufacturer, as well as a director of numerous banks and insurance and utility companies. Around 1917, Mrs. Sturgis built a garage behind the house, seen on the 1921 map here, which had a dwelling unit on the second floor that may have been occupied by one of the family employees. The main house was demolished in the 1920s or early 1930s, and its garage was converted to a residence by Mrs. Sturgis's daughter, Dorothy Sturgis, in 1932. She died the following year, but other family members occupied the house until 1980. After that, the house was converted to 2 dwelling units. By the late 1930s, change was beginning to come to the neighborhood around Cooke Street. Both Bryant College and Brown University began buying buildings here in the 1930s and 40s, converting some former houses to academic buildings or dormitories, and demolishing others for new construction, which introduced a larger scale and a decidedly different architectural aesthetic to this neighborhood. Brown bought many Bryant College buildings when that school relocated to Smithfield in 1971. And Brown now owns all of the buildings on the west side of Hope Street between Angel and Power Streets, as well as most of the 2 blocks on the east side of Hope between Power, Benevolent, and Cooke Streets. Also in the mid-20th century, new commercial uses were introduced on Angel and Waterman Streets, as well as at the northern end of Governor Street. Again, some of these were older homes adapted to office use, while others were new construction replacing older buildings, like this office building on Waterman Street. Here's the house that used to stand in that location, which was the John B. Palmer House, built about 1850 and demolished about a century later. But the Palmer Carriage House is still standing behind the office building and is now a private residence at 69 Cooke Street. Most of the new commercial and institutional construction was completed by the mid-1970s when this neighborhood was first surveyed to identify its historic buildings. Since then, there's been very little new construction or demolition here. Before we move on to discuss adding the Cooke Street area into the existing College Hill Local Historic District, let me take a moment to clarify the difference between the 2 types of historic districts, National Register and local. The National Register is best understood as a planning tool for preservation. It recognizes significant historic properties and offers some protection from publicly funded or permitted activities that may have a detrimental effect. For example, the relocation of Interstate 195 here in Providence was subject to a design review process through the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission and the National Park Service because the highway passes through or lies adjacent to 3 National Register historic districts in College Hill, downtown, and the Jewelry District. Privately funded actions affecting National Register listed property are not subject to any restrictions at all. Owners using their own money can alter, demolish, or build new construction at will. But National Register listing does provide a financial incentive for preservation. Owners of income-producing property, commercial, industrial, rental, residential, are eligible for a 20% federal income tax credit against the cost of exterior and interior rehabilitation work. Property owners who want to claim the tax credit do have to go through a design review process, and the rehab work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Owner-occupied single-family homes are not eligible for the federal historic tax credit. Rhode Island used to have a historic homeowner tax credit for exterior rehabilitation of owner-occupied single-family homes, but that program has not been available for several years now. The state historic tax credit program for income-producing properties was suspended in 2008, then reinstated on a limited basis in 2013 and 2014. Its status for 2015 and beyond will be determined by the Rhode Island General Assembly. Local historic districts, on the other hand, are a regulatory tool for preservation. The Local Historic District Commission, or HDC, is authorized to review all exterior work in a local historic district: repairs, replacements, alterations, demolition, new construction, and site improvements such as fencing or paving. All property owners within a local historic district are legally required to obtain the HDC's approval before conducting any exterior work, and there are penalties for failure to do so. Unfortunately, local historic districts do not come with financial incentives, but where National Register and local historic districts overlap, owners of income-producing historic properties can take advantage of historic tax credits. Under Providence's zoning ordinance, any area of the city that meets the criteria listed here for significance can be designated as a local historic district overlay zone, simply by changing the zoning maps. These are basically the same criteria for listing on the National Register, and they are properties associated with broad patterns, events, and or people that are significant in local, state, or national history, properties which embody the distinctive characteristics of a broad range of building types and architectural styles, properties which may possess high artistic value and or represent the work of a master builder, architect, landscape architect, or other designer, and properties which lack individual distinction but which add to the historic district's status as a significant and distinguishable sociocultural entity. In 1994, the City Plan Commission, which first reviews any proposal to change the zoning maps, adopted a policy for designating local historic districts, which includes these additional criteria beyond significance, as well as some guidance on the designation process. The first two of these criteria, dealing with significance and integrity, particularly informed my recommendation at the conclusion of the 2013 survey update to extend the boundaries of the College Hill Local Historic District into the Cooke Street neighborhood. This presentation has, I hope, amply demonstrated that the Cooke Street study area has historic and architectural significance as well as mostly good or excellent integrity. As previously noted, this small area is almost entirely listed on the National Register within one of several historic districts, and also has 7 houses recorded by HABs, as well as 2 National Historic Landmarks. The only parts of the study area that are not already in a National Register Historic District are the east side of Governor Street and one vacant lot at the corner of Hope and Charlesfield Streets, which is owned by Brown and used as a playground and parking lot. The density of housing on Governor Street is certainly higher than on Cooke Street, but it is similar to the density on Power Street. And while there are more multifamily buildings on Governor Street as compared to either Cooke or Power, there is no major difference in historic architectural character between one side of Governor Street and the other, as we can see in these examples here. The houses on Governor Street may be less individually distinctive than on Cooke Street, but most of them certainly could contribute to the significance of a historic district as a whole. Moreover, the larger College Hill Local Historic District contains plenty of 2-family and 3-family houses built in the same period as the housing stock on Governor Street. So, in terms of significance, both sides of Governor Street should be included in an expanded local historic district. This would also be consistent with best preservation practice for establishing historic district boundaries. Typically, buildings that were constructed within the past 50 years are considered to be non-contributing in a historic district. For the Cooke Street neighborhood, where the National Register nominations were written some 40 years ago, when all of the mid-20th century residential, commercial, and institutional buildings were less than 2 decades old, all were deemed non-contributing at that time. However, the Providence Historic District Commission can make its own determination as to whether a building is contributing or non-contributing to a local historic district. In that light, my own recommendation is that the handful of houses in this study area that were built in the 1950s and 1960s arguably can be considered contributing to a local historic district. These larger-scale mid-20th century institutional buildings do not appear to contribute much to a residential historic district that was largely constructed prior to 1930, although it is certainly preferable to have these buildings on those sites instead of parking lots. The historic and architectural significance of the Cooke Street neighborhood has been recognized for over half a century. It is impressive and encouraging to see how well preserved most of the individual buildings still are, and how the neighborhood as a whole retains its historic character, especially considering that all preservation efforts here, to date, have been voluntary. As PPS, the city and the property owners here consider future preservation goals, there is a very good foundation to build on.